Well, I had given Mike for Christmas a boys' trip to go play tennis, and so he had been gone for the weekend. So I took my kids actually to Carson's.
9:50 p.m., January 31st, 2026. Catalina Foothills, Tucson, Arizona. A garage door lowers slowly into the quiet darkness. An 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie steps inside her home. A black Lexus pulls away from the curb.
A porch light flicks off. The street settles back into silence.
To anyone watching, this looks like the unremarkable end of an ordinary evening. But it isn't. In exactly 41 minutes, a masked figure will move through that house with the cold, systematic precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times before. He knows where every camera is pointed. He knows exactly how much time he has. He knows the layout of the home before he ever sets foot inside it. He will not leave a fingerprint. He will not disturb a single piece of furniture. He will not make enough noise to alert one neighbor on that peaceful desert street. And Nancy Guthrie, the mother of NBC Today show anchor Savannah Guthrie, will be gone. But here is what the headlines never told you correctly. This is not a case without answers. Inside the chest of Nancy Guthrie, a small medical device was transmitting live cardiac data to a remote server entire time that masked figure moved through her home. And at precisely 2:28 a.m., that data stream stopped. Not gradually, not with interference, completely, permanently, in a single fraction of a second. The FBI knows when she died. They know where it happened. They have the DNA of the killer sitting in a federal laboratory right now. Genealogical analysis has already eliminated 87% of all possible suspects. The circle is closing. This is not a case that goes cold. This is a case that goes to court. Stay with me to the end of this video, because what you are about to hear will not be found anywhere else the way it is about to be told. Before we go any further, if you are someone who follows cases where the science matters more than the social media verdict, where real forensic evidence outweighs anonymous sources and viral rumors, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. When this case finally breaks open, and it will break open, you want to be here first. This channel does not deal in speculation. We follow the evidence. Now let us get into it. She was not famous. There was no verified account, no public profile, no name that would register on a search page, and no face that strangers would recognize in a grocery store. Nancy Guthrie was not known to the world the way her daughter was known to the world. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had spent decades building a quiet, ordered life, and who had chosen to spend her final years in one of the most peaceful residential neighborhoods in southern Arizona. The Catalina Foothills sit at the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains north of Tucson. The streets are wide, the properties are large, neighbors know each other, security systems are standard, crime rates are low, and property values are high. It is precisely the kind of place where a woman living alone can feel genuinely safe, where an 84-year-old with a cardiac condition can go to sleep at night without fear. It was the last place anyone expected something like this to happen. Nancy Guthrie lived a quiet, fiercely independent life in the shadow of the Santa Catalina Mountains. At 84, she still drove herself to the grocery store, tended her desert garden of saguaro and ocotillo, and every Sunday morning she tuned in to the online church service she had watched for years. Her medications were lined up on the kitchen counter like soldiers, her reading glasses always resting on the same page of the novel she read slowly each evening, and her phone stayed plugged in beside the coffee maker, exactly where she liked it. She had raised 3 children, buried her husband decades earlier, and chosen to grow old on her own terms in the peaceful Catalina Foothills, the kind of neighborhood where neighbors wave but never pry. To everyone who knew her, she was simply Mom, Grandma, the steady heart of the family. The last person on earth anyone expected to vanish. On the evening of January 31st, her son-in-law, Tommaso Occhione, had driven her home from a family dinner. He pulled into the driveway at 9:48 p.m. He walked her to the garage entrance, waited,
and watched the garage door descend fully to the ground before he returned to his car. The security camera at the entrance captured all of it. Nancy moving inside with steady, confident steps, the door closing, the car pulling away down the dark street. The timestamp on that footage reads 9:50 p.m. Inside the house, everything was exactly where it always was. Her smartphone sat on the kitchen counter plugged into the charger. Her medications were arranged in their precise positions along the surface, the way someone arranges them when they have managed a serious health condition for years, and know down to the minute where every dose needs to be by morning. Her reading glasses were folded on top of a novel she had been working through slowly, the way you read when you have the luxury of time and know where you need to be. Her car sat cold and untouched in the garage. Her purse hung from a dining room chair. None of those things moved, because the only thing that left that house that night was Nancy Guthrie herself, and she did not leave by choice. The blood that forensic pathologist Michael Botten examined on the exterior porch told investigators something deeply specific. The droplets had pale, nearly translucent centers. To a trained eye, that detail is not incidental. It means the blood mixed with air before it struck the surface. It means the source of the bleeding was not an external wound, but the upper respiratory tract. Nancy was coughing blood. She was fighting to breathe. She was being moved, carried, or dragged from the interior of her home toward the driveway, while her body was already in catastrophic physiological distress. She was 84 years old. She had a documented cardiac history. She had no phone, no shoes, no medication, and not a single person in the world who knew she needed help. Laboratory confirmation followed the physical evidence. The blood on that porch belonged to Nancy Guthrie. What happened in the 41 minutes that followed is the center of everything. 2 years before her disappearance, Nancy Guthrie had a Medtronic Avra dual-chamber pacemaker implanted to manage a serious cardiac arrhythmia. This is a Class 3 medical device, among the most advanced of its kind. And it does not simply regulate the rhythm of the heart, it reports on it, continuously, in real time, every 60 seconds. The device transmitted a complete package of telemetry data to a remote clinical monitoring application connected to the office of her cardiologist. Electrocardiogram readings, cardiac variability metrics, internal battery status. Her doctor could access the full history of her heart, function at any hour of any day, without her ever setting foot inside an office. That device was running the entire time someone moved through her home. Here is what the data tells us. At 9:50 p.m., the garage door closed. Nancy was home, alive, and on camera. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera feed went completely dark. This was not a software failure. A software failure leaves a signature in the server, a degrading signal, failed reconnection attempts, a broken handshake recorded in the log file. What the central server captured at 1:47 a.m. was an instantaneous and total blackout. One moment the device existed on the network, the next moment it did not. The camera was physically torn from its mounting bracket by hand. At 2:12 a.m., motion sensors from a long-expired security subscription registered activity in or near the property. The hardware was still physically embedded in the walls, even though Nancy had stopped paying for the monitoring service months earlier. Investigators obtained those dormant records through a court order compelling the security company to produce archived server data. At 2:28 a.m. and 3 seconds, the pacemaker telemetry stopped transmitting. 3 independent cardiologists were consulted, each interviewed separately, each with no prior connection to the case. Each asked the same single question. What does it mean when the remote monitoring signal from a device of this type simply stops, with no gradual degradation, no interference pattern, and no reconnection of any kind? Each one gave the same answer. The monitoring signal ceases when the cardiac activity generating those electrical impulses no longer exists. In a post-mortem state, there are no accidental reconnections and no signal variations. There is only silence.
Nancy Guthrie died at 2:28 a.m. inside her own home in Catalina Foothills, Tucson, Arizona. 41 minutes. That is the precise distance between the destruction of the camera and the silencing of the pacemaker. 41 minutes for one individual, moving through a home he clearly had prior knowledge of, to complete what he came to do. And the interior of that home, when investigators arrived, showed no overturned furniture, no visible signs of a physical struggle, no biological material from the intruder within the walls. Not one neighbor on that street had heard a sound during the entire window. Experienced, violent. Crime investigators used one word to describe the interior of that house: unnervingly clean. This was not a panicked individual acting on impulse. This was not a robbery that escalated beyond the point of no return. This was a premeditated, rehearsed operation carried out by someone who had surveilled that property well in advance, who understood every camera position, who knew the floor plan, who had mapped the schedule of an elderly woman living alone, and who had prepared a deliberate solution for every obstacle he anticipated. He missed one: his own DNA. Think carefully about what it takes to do what this person did. Not the violence. Set that aside for a moment. Think about the logistics. Think about the preparation. Think about standing outside a residential property in one of the most secure neighborhoods in Tucson, Arizona, at nearly 2 in the morning, with a mask on your face and thick canvas gloves on your hands, and feeling no hesitation. None. Not a tremor of doubt. Not a single instinct telling you to turn around and walk away. That is not a profile that emerges overnight. The final frames recovered from the doorbell camera, server before transmission was severed, show a figure moving toward the device with deliberate, measured steps. He is not jogging. He's not frantically scanning the street the way someone acts when they are about to do something they have not fully planned. His head moves in slow, controlled arcs, the way a trained professional sweeps a perimeter, avoiding direct eye contact with any lens in the area. His shoulders are level, his posture is controlled. When he reaches the camera, he does not flinch at the recording light. He was expecting it. He came specifically to eliminate it. A criminally inexperienced person does not do that. A person acting on rage or impulse does not do that. Someone in the grip of a sudden, desperate decision does not spend time before the act calculating the precise mounting height of a doorbell camera so they can approach from an angle that minimizes their exposure to neighboring surveillance systems. This individual had visited that property before, multiple times. He knew the camera positions before he stood in front of them. He had mapped the dead zones in the neighborhood surveillance grid, and he had designed his approach route specifically to exploit them. His equipment, the mask, the gloves, the specific type and weight of the canvas used, was not grabbed from a drawer in a panic. It was selected, prepared, part of a kit assembled in advance with this specific operation in mind. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit profiling this case has been working with a framework that does not start with motive in the way the public usually understands motive. Most people, when they try to solve a case like this, begin with the question, what did someone stand to gain? Money, inheritance, a property dispute, some kind of financial pressure that finally boiled over. But the behavioral profile here does not fit any of those templates. A financially motivated attack on an 84-year-old woman living alone does not require 41 minutes of silent, controlled operation inside the property. It does not require the level of pre-operation surveillance that this case clearly shows took place. It does not require the tactical neutralization of camera infrastructure before entry. And it absolutely does not produce a crime scene interior with no visible disturbance and no recoverable biological trace from the attacker. Financial desperation produces chaos. This produced the opposite. 2 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished, ransom notes arrived at multiple television news stations. The demand was Bitcoin. The name in those notes was not just Nancy. The notes identified her specifically in relation to her daughter. The notes were written for an audience, and that audience had one face. Retired FBI agents who have spent careers working cases where celebrities or public figures become the focus of obsessive behavior describe this pattern with clinical precision. When the object of fixation is genuinely unreachable, when the distance between the obsessed individual and the person they have centered their psychological world around is too vast to bridge directly, the obsession frequently redirects towards someone close, someone accessible, someone whose suffering will be witnessed by the person who was always the real target. Nancy Guthrie had no public life of her own. She had no social media presence that would expose her location. She had no professional profile that would lead a stranger to a residential address in Tucson, Arizona. The only reason a person outside her immediate family circle would know where she lived is if they had spent significant time and effort researching the private life of her daughter. The only reason to do that research is a fixation that had been building for a long time. The behavioral profile is specific. Male, likely between 30 and 55. Technically proficient enough to locate a private residential address, conduct repeated physical surveillance of the property without detection, and execute a 41-minute operation with enough precision to avoid leaving visible evidence inside the structure. Someone whose need for recognition, for the sensation of controlling the attention of a powerful and visible woman, had become so consuming that it had finally overridden whatever rational calculation might have told him to stop. Sending ransom demands to CNN is not the behavior of someone trying to stay invisible. It is the behavior of someone who wanted to see their actions reflected back to them through the largest possible lens. The money was secondary. The Bitcoin address in those notes was either genuine or theater. In either case, it was never the point. The point was the chaos. The point was watching Savannah Guthrie have to stand in front of a camera and speak about her missing mother, knowing that he had made that happen. The profile has a name it cannot yet attach to. The science is working on that. I want to stop here for just a second, because what comes next is honestly the part of this case that I think about the most. This is where the story stops being about what happened and starts being about what is going to happen. And I want to know what you think. Drop a comment right now. Do you believe the DNA evidence alone is enough to repair? Close this case. Just type yes or no and tell me why, because I read every single comment on this channel, and the conversation in there is genuinely worth being part of. All right, let us talk about the science that is going to bring this person down. The killer left something behind. He was meticulous. He was prepared. He had clearly studied what it takes to move through a crime scene without leaving visible trace evidence, and by most measures, he succeeded. The interior of Nancy Guthrie's home gave investigators almost nothing. No fingerprints on surfaces he had touched, no hair follicles on fabric, no shoe impressions on the floor that could not be attributed to the family. But biological material is not always visible. It does not always announce itself, and the human body sheds cellular evidence in ways that no amount of preparation can entirely prevent, particularly during physical contact, during a struggle, during the kind of sustained effort required to move an 84-year-old woman from the interior of a home to a waiting vehicle in the middle of the night. Within 48 hours of Annie Guthrie calling 911, forensic technicians had recovered an unknown male DNA profile from the property. It did not match Nancy. It did not match Annie. It did not match Tommaso Occhioni. It did not match Savannah Guthrie, who voluntarily submitted her own sample to be formally excluded. It did not match any family member, household employee, or frequent visitor who cooperated with the early rounds of investigative interviews. One man, unknown to the system, his entire biological identity compressed into a sequence of genetic markers sitting inside a federal evidence refrigerator waiting. In the years before 2018, that would have been the end of the road. An unidentified DNA profile with no match in the National Criminal Database is a wall. The evidence exists. The science confirms a specific individual was present, and the investigation goes nowhere because that individual had never been arrested, never been convicted, never had their genetic material entered into any law enforcement registry. That wall no longer exists. In April 2018, investigators working the Golden State Killer case uploaded an unidentified DNA profile to GED Match, a publicly accessible genealogical database where ordinary citizens voluntarily deposit their genetic ancestry data. They were not looking for the killer directly. They were looking for his relatives, third cousins, half-siblings removed by 2 generations, anyone who shared enough markers to indicate a common ancestor. They found them. Genealogists working alongside detectives began constructing family trees, tracing lineages forward and backward through time, identifying every living male descendant in the relevant age range whose geographic history placed him near the crime scenes. The circle contracted over months of painstaking analysis until one name remained: Joseph James D'Angelo. A retired police officer living in a Sacramento suburb, a man who had terrorized California for over a decade, committed at least 13 confirmed murders, carried out 50 sexual assaults, and evaded justice for 40 years, while his DNA sat on evidence swabs that could never find him. He was arrested when investigators collected a discarded item he had thrown away and confirmed the match. He was 72 years old. The FBI unit handling the Guthrie case is running the same methodology right now. The unknown male profile has been uploaded. Partial matches are generating family trees. Genealogical analysts are tracing branches forward to living males in the relevant age range with geographic proximity to Tucson. The process has already eliminated 87% of all possible candidates. The remaining 13% is not a comfortable number to sit inside if you are the person this profile belongs to. The Bitcoin trail is a parallel line of pursuit, and it is not as cold as the killer likely believes. There is a persistent and deeply mistaken cultural assumption that cryptocurrency transactions are untraceable, that the decentralized nature of the blockchain provides genuine anonymity to anyone willing to exploit it. This assumption has contributed to the downfall of a significant number of individuals who staked their freedom on it. The blockchain is a permanent, publicly accessible ledger. Every transaction ever executed on the Bitcoin network is recorded and visible to anyone with an internet connection. The challenge for investigators is not accessing the transaction history. The challenge is de-anonymizing it, connecting specific wallet addresses to specific real-world identities. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit has developed advanced blockchain forensic capability through years of high-profile cases, and the wallet addresses specified in the ransom notes sent to television stations have been under continuous scrutiny since the day those notes were received. Money moving through mixing services leaves traces at conversion points. Every time digital currency converts to physical currency or is used to acquire goods, validation requirements produce records, IP addresses, geolocation coordinates, data that service providers are legally compelled to produce under court order. The trail through the mixers in this case is still being followed. The destination is real. Then there's the question of where he was standing at 1:30 in the morning. Every mobile device active within the coverage area of the cell towers serving Catalina. Foothills between midnight and 4 a.m. on the morning of February 1st, 2026, was identified and secured through judicial order as soon as the timeline was established. The list of devices in that area during that window was then systematically filtered. Residents identified by their service contracts, delivery vehicles confirmed by dispatch records, emergency personnel logged at the scene. What remains after that filtering process is a small set of anomalies. Devices with no residential or commercial justification for their presence at that hour. Devices that entered the perimeter near 1:30 a.m. and departed near 2:45 a.m., precisely consistent with the operational window established by the forensic timeline. devices that may have been powered off during the critical period, which is itself a behavioral indicator, because ordinary people do not switch off their phones in the middle of the night without a reason they would prefer not to have documented. And finally, the footage. 10,000 hours of surveillance camera recordings from across the Bliss, Tucson metro area have been fed into a gait analysis system used by federal investigators. The figure captured in the final frames of Nancy Guthrie's doorbell. Camera has a biometric movement signature: stride length, hip rotation, arm swing asymmetry, weight distribution on each footfall. These characteristics are as individually unique as a fingerprint. They are also impossible to consciously suppress, because gait emerges from skeletal structure and neurological patterning, not from deliberate choice. If that figure appears anywhere in those 10:0 hours, at a traffic intersection, outside a business, in a parking structure near a route he used to surveil the property, the system will flag the match. The identification will not require a face. It will not require a confession. The way he walks is already on record. On February 4th, 3 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home, a well-known true crime podcast released an episode citing a source described as having complete access to the active investigative file. The episode named Tommaso Occhioni as the primary suspect. Within 72 hours, that clip had accumulated 12 million views. Reddit threads constructed detailed timelines with headers and diagrams and upvoted confidence, each one oriented toward the same conclusion. Social media accounts with audiences in the hundreds of thousands declared the case effectively solved. The note about sources being unverified and conclusions being speculative was included near the end of the original episode, spoken quickly, and removed from virtually every clipped version that spread across platforms. What traveled at 12 million views was not nuance. It was a name. The irony, which the science had already established before a single camera crew parked outside that house, is that Tommaso Occhioni was not the person investigators needed to find. The forensic evidence pointing away from him existed before the first search of his property was ever authorized. The unknown male DNA recovered from the crime scene did not match him. The final frame of the doorbell camera showed a figure whose build and movement pattern did not correspond to his physical profile. The precision of the 41-minute operation, the total absence of internal disorder, the preemptive destruction of surveillance infrastructure, the calculated approach route, none of these were consistent with the behavioral signature of a person acting from personal motive in a domestic context. And critically, Tommaso Occhioni had no history of violence, no restraining orders, no documented conflicts with Nancy or Annie. Not a single witness who could describe a relationship under strain. Nothing. The searches of his property on February 8th and again on February 13th produced exactly what the actual forensic record already predicted they would produce. The septic tank, excavated under national media attention while aerial cameras transmitted the images live to morning news programs, contained nothing relevant to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The bedroom. Investigation yielded no biological connection to the crime scene evidence. The truck was analyzed and cleared. The digital devices produced nothing of investigative value. 23 bags of collected material were processed. The conclusion was absolute. On February 16th, the lead investigator stood before cameras and made a statement that received a fraction of the coverage the original accusation had generated. The entire Guthrie family, including all spouses, had been formally excluded as suspects. They had been fully cooperative. They were the victims. Not a qualified statement, not a holding pattern until new evidence emerged. An exoneration issued by the highest investigative authority on the case, after every available resource had been committed to testing the hypothesis that Tommaso Occhioni was responsible, and that hypothesis had been categorically disproven. The correction traveled at the speed of a Tuesday afternoon news cycle. The accusation had traveled at 12 million views in 72 hours. That asymmetry is not a footnote. It is the reason the actual perpetrator has been able to walk through ordinary life for months
while the public argued about a man who drove his. Mother-in-law home from dinner and waited at the bottom of her driveway to make sure the garage door closed all the way before he left. 94 days. Nancy Guthrie's medications are still sitting on the kitchen counter of a house in Catalina foothills. No one has moved them because no one has had a reason to. Her reading glasses are still folded on the page where she stopped. Her car is still in the garage, the engine untouched since January 31st. The small, ordered details of a life are frozen in place, while the people who loved her exist in a state that has no precise name. Not grieving, because grief requires a confirmed ending, and not hoping, because hope requires a viable possibility to hold on to. Her family has been living inside that suspension for more than 3 months. The person responsible for it has been living inside something else. The performance of normalcy. The management of a secret that he has convinced himself is becoming safer with each passing week, that the distance between that night and the present moment is functioning as insulation, that what he did is receding into the past in the same way that his own anxiety about it has learned to quiet itself during daylight hours. He is wrong about this in every specific way that matters. DNA stored in a federal evidence facility does not age the way memory ages. The sequence of markers that place him at that property is as intact today as it was on the morning it was collected. The genealogical analysis has not paused. The family trees being constructed from partial matches on ancestry databases are not waiting for the case to become culturally relevant again before the next branch gets traced. This work happens continuously, methodically, indifferent to news cycles and trending topics. The blockchain ledger containing the transaction history of the wallet addresses in those ransom notes is a permanent record that no technical measure can retroactively alter. Every movement of those funds is documented and will remain documented. The forensic accountants following that trail are not working toward a deadline. They are working toward a name. The gate analysis system processing surveillance footage does not forget the movement signature it is looking for. It is running comparisons every time a new hour of footage is added to the queue. It will flag a match from footage recorded months ago just as readily as footage recorded yesterday. And somewhere in Tucson, or close enough to Tucson to have made those reconnaissance visits to Catalina foothills without drawing attention, a person is living with the knowledge of what he did. That knowledge does not dissipate. It accumulates weight. It reshapes behavior in ways that people around him are beginning to notice, even if they cannot yet name what they are noticing. And a reward of $1 million has a specific and well-documented effect on the loyalty of people who are close to someone carrying that kind of weight. The science does not say years. The science says months. The answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie is already in us. Federal laboratory. It has a sequence and a family tree and a narrowing list of living men in the correct age range with the correct geographic history and the correct physical profile. The question is not whether that name gets found. The question is only how many weeks remain between now and the moment it does. Before I let you go, I want to say something, and I mean it genuinely. This channel exists because of you, not the algorithm, not the trending page, you. The people who actually care about getting the story right. The ones who stay until the end, who read the sources, who push back when something does not add up. If this video gave you something, a clearer picture, a new angle, something to think about, please share it with one person, not for the views, but because Nancy Guthrie deserves for the right story to travel farther than the wrong one did. A huge thank you to everyone who has been with us from the beginning. And to everyone who just found us today, welcome. You are in the right place. Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one, and I will see you in the next case.